Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another lecture on academic report writing. Now today we'll be looking at the academic style for reports. And first of all, we'll look at what this involves. So the written style of the paper is definitely important. Style refers both to the conventions of arrangement and layout, and as well as to conventions of the written language that you're using. The selected style will also include issues of punctuation, hyphenation, italicizing, and spelling. The bibliographic and citation style consisted with APA referencing guidelines or whatever referencing guidelines your faculty advises you to use, as well as the page layout and sections. So some additional pointers regarding style for you to please check in your work is that academic writing must be accurate and clearly understood. Therefore, its language must be precise. So you have to say exactly what you mean. The agreement of subject, verb, and pronoun is also important. The most common problem is number agreement, whether it should be singular or plural, so that's one thing to look out for. There should be a clear construction of paragraphs. Treat each paragraph as a module around a particular main idea. There should be sentence variety to break up the monotony of your writing. There should be little to no mention of first person, as the academic writing style is definitely not a first person style. And there should be no use of informal, colloquial, or slang words. There should also be very rare use of hypothetical questions. These are easy to overuse as a transitional device and tend to weaken your voice as the writer and therefore weaken your argument as well. Now, a key feature of reports is that they are formally structured in sections. The use of sections makes it easy for the reader to jump straight to the information that they need. Unlike an essay, which is written in a single narrative style from start to finish, each section of a report has its own purpose and will need to be written in an appropriate style to suit this. For example, the methods and results sections are mainly descriptive, whereas the discussion section needs to be analytical. Now, understanding the function of each section will help you to structure your information and use the correct writing style. Reports for different briefs require different sections, so always check carefully any instructions that you've been given by your lecturer or tutor. Now let's have a review of the different report sections which have been covered in a previous lecture. Now the abstract, also called the summary or the executive summary, this is considered to be the shop window for your report. It's the first and sometimes the only section to be read and should be the last to be written. It should enable the reader to make an informed decision about whether they want to read the whole report. The length will depend on the extent of the work reported, but it is usually a paragraph or two and always less than a page. A good way to write an abstract is to think of it as a series of brief answers to questions, which would include this question: what is the purpose of the work? What methods did you use for your research? What were the main findings and conclusions reached as a result of your research? And did your work lead you to make any recommendations for future actions? Now moving on to the introduction section of your report. In this section you explain the rationale for undertaking the work reported on, including what you have been asked or chosen to do, the reasons for doing it, and the background to the study, and it should also be written in an explanatory style. Next, you should state what the report is about. What's the question you're trying to answer? If it is a brief for a specific reader, for example, a feasibility report on a construction project for a client, say who they are. Describe your starting point and the background to the subject, for instance. What research has already been done, if you've been asked to include a literature survey, that is. And also, what are the relevant themes and issues? Why are you being asked to investigate it now? So this is where you would mention all of these things within the introduction. Next, explain how you're going to go about responding to the brief. If you are going to test a hypothesis in your research, include this at the end of your introduction. Include a brief outline of your method of inquiry. State the limits of your research and reasons for them. For example, research will focus on native English speakers only, as a proper consideration of the issues arising from speaking English as a second language is beyond the scope of this project. So that's one way of including this information in your introduction. Next, the literature review, which is also called a literature survey or a survey/review of research. Now, this is a survey of publications such as books, journals, websites, conference papers, which report work that's already been done on the topic of your report. It should only include studies that have direct relevance to your research. A literature survey should be written like an essay in a discursive style with an introduction, main discussion grouped in themes, and a conclusion. Now, introduce your review by explaining how you went about finding your materials and any clear trends in research that have emerged. And finally, conclude with how the review has informed your research, such as things you'll be building on or gaps you'll be filling, and so on. Now, the method section, also called methodology, you need to write your method section in such a way that a reader could replicate or repeat the research you have done exactly. There should be no ambiguity here, so you need to write in a very factual, informative style. You also need to state clearly how you carried out your investigation. Explain why you chose this particular method, for instance, through questionnaires, focus groups, and so on. Include techniques and any equipment you used. If there are participants in your research, who were they? How many? How were they selected? And so on. Now, write this section concisely but thoroughly. Go through what you did step by step, including everything that is relevant. You know what you did, but could a reader follow your description? Now, the results section, also called data or findings, this section has only one job, which is to present the findings of your research as simply and clearly as possible. Use the format that will achieve this most effectively, such as via text, graphs, tables, or diagrams, and so on. Now, when deciding on a graphical format to use, think about how the data will look to the reader. Choose just one format. Don't repeat the same information in, for instance, a graph and a table. Also, don't forget to label your graphs and tables clearly, give each figure a title, and describe in words what the figure demonstrates. Finally, writing in this section should be clear, factual, and informative. Save your interpretation of the results for the discussion section, which is next. Now, this is probably the longest section and worth spending a lot of time on. It brings everything together, showing how your findings respond to the brief you explained in your introduction and the previous research in your literature survey. It should be written in a discursive style, meaning you need to discuss not only what your findings show, but why they show this, using evidence from previous research to back up your explanations. This is also the place to mention if there were any problems. For instance, if your results were different from expectations, you couldn't find important data, or you had to change your method or participants, and how they were or could have been solved. And next, the conclusion. Your conclusion should be a short section with no new arguments or evidence. Sum up the main points of your research, as in how do they answer the original brief for the work reported on. Now, this section may also include recommendations for action and suggestions for further research. Now, writing up your report. An important difference between essays and reports to bear in mind is that essays are written in a single narrative voice from beginning to end, while reports are written in sections which may use different styles of writing depending on the purpose of the section. So, for example, your methods and results sections will be written in a descriptive style. Your introduction will be written in an explanatory style. And your literature review as well as discussion sections will be analytical. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail later. Now, what makes a good or a bad report? Some of the more common problems in poor reports includes writers who don't answer the brief, so they do not address the actual question or problem mentioned in the brief. The report is badly structured, probably in the way the headings are organized or the content is laid out. The writing style is inappropriate. There's poor grammar and punctuation, incorrect or inadequate referencing, too much or too little or irrelevant material mentioned, unclear expressions of ideas or content, doesn't relate the results to the purpose, as well as an unnecessary use of jargon. So these are some things to avoid when writing up your report. So how can you make sure your report is written well? Well, here are some tips that could help you, hopefully. First of all, write clearly and concisely. Better report writing isn't just about getting your information in the right place. It's also about communicating it appropriately. Now, this means using the language, styles, and conventions of academic writing. The key is to think of your proposed readers. Who are you writing the report for? Now, these people are your audience. Is your audience likely to include readers outside of your discipline who will not understand highly technical terms? Or is it for your peers or colleagues, whether real or hypothetical? Now let's get into what writing academically actually means. So first of all, it means writing in such a way that your information sounds credible and authoritative. However, it does not mean that this gives you permission to use long words or to write complicated sentences with lots of semicolons and colons. The key is to write to express, not to impress. Keep that in mind and hopefully you'll be on the right track. Now, how else can we write academically? So here's some suggestions to make your writing better and more academic. First of all, write objectively. Report what the evidence tells you, even if it isn't what you hope to find. Don't present unsupported or personal opinions. For instance, unsurprisingly, participants who recycled their refuse more regularly were also nicer people. Make sure you have a balanced, unbiased, unprejudiced view. 2. Write accurately. Give clear, non-subjective descriptions. For example, light blue is better than sky blue, and definite figures. Avoid vague or ambiguous terms like a long period of time or most of the participants, when you can state exactly how long a period of time and how many participants. Write directly and concisely. Don't leave it to your reader to work out what you're saying. Putting the emphasis on a strong verb, for example, can help the reader to see the important points. For instance, an analysis was performed on the results was not as direct as the results were analyzed. Write critically. Evaluate your own work as well as that of others. Have the confidence to say if something could have been done better, if it had been done differently. And finally, write appropriately. Avoid using colloquialisms, informality, and contractions. For instance, use do not instead of don't. It might be argued instead of you could say. Exclamation marks, text speak, and emoticons are definitely not a good idea. Now, writing objectively. So as well as being concise, it is also important to be objective in writing reports. Here are some strategies you can use to develop an objective writing style. First of all, to be objective, you should be accurate. Express ideas accurately by including some sense of precision, which can be achieved by quantifying something or expressing it in measurement terms, such as, instead of using a lot, say a high proportion or a large proportion. Instead of saying quite a few, 5 to 6 approximately. And instead of saying a long time, state exactly how long of a time, for instance, 3 hours. Another tip on being objective is to be impersonal. So use an impersonal tone. Instead of using personal pronouns such as I argue, I recommend, or I suggest, use passive structures such as it is argued that, can be argued, it is recommended that. Next, to be objective, avoid drama. So it's important to get rid of any exaggeration or dramatic words used in your writing. The following examples highlight some words that may not be the best idea for you to use in academic writing, such as it is extremely important to, absolutely essential, completely destroy, completely fill, and very unique. So try and avoid these unnecessary terms in academic writing. Just be as precise as you need to be and no more. Now, tip number 2 on being academic in your writing is to write concisely. So reports are a type of informative writing, and conciseness is important to convey the information that your audience needs as effectively and as quickly as possible. So how can we be concise in our writing? First of all, you should write to the word count. So keep in mind how many words you are allowed to write in your report and make sure you keep within those confines. Edit ruthlessly. So once you've got all of your content down, then make sure you trim all of the unnecessary words or ideas that your report may have. Avoid unnecessary background description. So some of us are guilty of writing a bit too much in our backgrounds. So make sure that you only include what is necessary for your reader to know. Check the first sentence of each paragraph. Now, the first sentence of each paragraph is arguably the most important sentence, as it sets the tone and lets your reader know what that entire paragraph is going to be about. So make sure the first sentence of all your paragraphs are on point, accurate, and precise. Still on writing concisely, important features of this type of writing also includes accurate grammar and appropriate use of tenses as well as technical terms. So make sure in your first sentence you get straight to the point. For example, the first issue is, involves, relates to, etc. Or a second issue focuses on. And finally, the context presents another relevant issue. So these types of structures used in your first sentences immediately alerts your reader to what you are going to talk about in your paragraph. Another tip is to consider whether a phrase adds new meaning to a sentence. For example, the point is that. Is it really necessary for you to say this phrase? Maybe you should just state the point immediately without the build-up, without starting it with that phrase, the point is that. Another example is all things considered, the factors are, it's assumed automatically by your reader that you will have considered all points in coming to your conclusion. So this type of phrase may not be necessary. Another good example is as a matter of fact. In a very general sense, it's often assumed in academic writing that you are dealing with factual evidence, so there may be no need to assert something as a fact. Another point is to explain the point more simply. for instance, instead of saying at the present time, it would be better to say presently. Instead of in spite of the fact that, although would be clearer. Instead of in the event that, if would be much more concise. Now, writing critically is an important component of academic writing. One way of achieving this is by not immediately accepting the conclusions of other writers without evaluating the arguments and evidence that they provide. Secondly, you should provide an unbiased presentation of why the conclusions or ideas of other writers may be accepted or may need to be treated with caution. Third, clearly present your own evidence and argument leading to your conclusion. And finally, you should recognize the limitations in your own evidence, argument, as well as conclusion. So make sure you are critical in your writing, whether that's critically evaluating other sources or your own ideas. Now next is writing appropriately. So when it comes to academic reports, you have to make sure you're using formal language. Now have a look at this sample paragraph and try and replace the non-academic words in this text with more appropriate academic language. Now this text can be found in the first handout on the blog. Complete this exercise and bring it to class to discuss with your lecturer and classmates. Now next we'll look at writing styles and tenses. Reports are written in sections which may use different styles of writing depending on the purpose of the section. So for example, your methods and results sections will be factual and descriptive, your introduction will be explanatory, and your literature survey and discussion sections will be discursive and analytical. Now, descriptive writing gives a detailed account of the characteristics of things. Discursive writing investigates things by reasoning or making a reasoned examination. Factual writing states the facts of the case exactly as they are without embellishment. Analytical writing examines complex things to discover how they work. And explanatory writing makes things clear and gives the reasons for them. So you may use any or all of these styles in your report in the different separate sections. Now, grammar is certainly very important in academic writing as well. There are conventions for when you should use different tenses. The general rules are, when you're reporting your findings, use the past tense as you're reporting on something that has already happened. When you're reporting other people's research, however, use the present tense as you're relating something that is established knowledge and still true now. And then when you're discussing your findings, use the present tense as well. So for example, you might write, Smith in 2005 argues that the precise dimensions of this variable are not crucial. However, our experiment showed wide variations in results when the variable was altered even slightly. We conclude that the correct choice of dimensions is a significant factor in achieving success with this procedure. So note that there are different tenses within this one paragraph, as each sentence is referring to a different section or serves a separate purpose as the rest. Now, some common errors that writers make when writing up a report includes the changing of tense partway through a sentence when there has not been a change in the time frame for the actions that are taking place. For example, the machine contains many components that worked in unison. Can you spot the error here? It should instead be the machine contains many components that work in unison. However, this following sentence is correct, as the students are currently still enjoying a facility which they have already built. The students are enjoying their new union bar, which they built themselves. So describing two different events that happened in two separate time frames. Now, using pronouns also tends to be a tricky area with writers. Words such as he, she, it, they, them must be used carefully to ensure that it's clear as to what or whom the pronoun is referring to. For example, after modifications, the machine was more difficult to set up, but fewer bottlenecks occurred, productivity increased, and material wastage became negligible. This played an important role in the current financial status of the company. Now, it's not clear what the word "this" refers to in this sentence. Is it referring to the reduction in waste material? Or is it referring to the productivity increase? So the sentences should be revised to remove this ambiguity. As you can see in the improved text, this was replaced with the phrase "these modifications," so it's clear to the reader what the writer is referring to. Now, writing in paragraphs is definitely important as well. You have to make sure each paragraph you write is also structured, and these will be covered in a later lecture. But here's a reminder that you have to make sure you keep to one main point per paragraph. This is true for essays. It is also true for report writing. Now, technical terms, abbreviations, and acronyms, make sure that you use the appropriate technical terms, but try not to use jargon. It may be helpful to briefly explain a technical term the first time you use it. There may also be lists of standard abbreviations that are used for the most important journals in your discipline. Ask in your department or check your library's reference section for these most common abbreviations. Also, for some reports, you may be asked to provide a glossary, which is a list of specialist terms used in the report, which may also include technical terms, abbreviations, and acronyms. So, more tips on writing a good report. First of all, read the brief. Make sure you know what the brief is asking for, and check that whatever you're doing is actually relevant to when you're planning how to conduct your research and when you write it up. Next, remember that reports are meant to be informative. Reports tell the reader what was done, what was discovered as a result, and how this relates to the reasons the report was undertaken. Include only relevant material in your background and discussion. Consider who you're writing for. A report is an active communication between you and your reader, so pay special attention to who your supposed reader is and what they want from you in the report. Write simply and appropriately. Keep your expression clear and simple. If the purpose of a report is to inform, it won't be achieving that purpose if you use complicated phrases and jargon. So be as simple and as appropriate as you can. Spend more time on your discussion section, because this section pulls your whole report together by showing how your findings relate to the purpose of the report and to any previous research. Make sure that all the issues raised in your introduction or literature review are referred to and linked up with your own research in your own discussion. Now finally, here are some helpful links for you to refer to. The first one is an academic phrase bank, which lists out the most common academic phrases used. And the second link is the top 60 most common academic words used as well. So have a look at both these websites if you happen to be stuck on academic sentences and phrases. But for now, that's it for this lecture. Until the next one, have a break, and I will see you next time.